great to have you all here. It's my great pride to introduce our next session on African diasporas. I talked to the President of Ghana quite a bit about this also when Ambassador Ramayad, the Senior Director of our Africa Center, and I were visiting with him in Accra. African countries and Africa as a whole are rising actors in international relations. In recognition of this fact, the Biden administration announced just this month, for the first time, that we'll support 2 permanent seats for African nations at the United Nations Security Council. Big deal. At the Atlantic Council, our Africa Center is at the core of our work. And I mentioned Rama because she brings to us a knowledge of Europe, having been in the cabinet of President Sarkozy, a knowledge of Africa, obviously having been born in Dakar, Senegal, and increasingly a knowledge of Washington as well. Alongside initiatives focused on classic issues such as security and development, the Africa Center has launched many dynamic programs that set it apart, doing things nobody else is doing, ranging from sports to creative industries. These emerging markets herald a new African century. There's plenty of problems to write about in Africa, plenty of challenges to follow. But there's also an amazing amount of potential and promise, and we try to understand the challenges, but underscore also the possibilities. In Accra, I saw the vibrant energy of African youth and the booming of the new tech landscape. I left with no doubt that Africa will play a big role in the future of the global economy and the future of U.S. international relations. Last night, when we honored the President of Ghana, and he was introduced by the President of Kenya, it's our first African recipient of our highest honor. It highlighted not only that Ghana and Kenya are 2 important African powerhouses, but also that African strength shines everywhere. The African Development Bank anticipates African real GDP growth of 3.7% in 2024, 4.3% in 2025, highlighting the resilience of African economies. The Africa tech landscape is an important part of that growth, as our 2 supporters of this session, Meta and the African Export-Import Bank, can attest as major actors in this space. And very interesting to look at those 2 partners, one American, one from the continent, understanding the promise. So thank you to President Orama of Afreximbank, and thank you to Gojo Boykai of Meta for your partnership and presence today. Your chat will help us understand how the African diaspora is not just a community, but a vibrant, innovative force with the power to bridge continents and drive global progress. Our focus today is on harnessing this immense potential to advance the digital economy through emerging technologies and thus foster economic growth and prosperity across Africa. We at the Atlantic Council analyze, we do scholarly work, we try to make sense of what's going on, but most of all, we try to move the needle in a positive direction, and that's what we're doing here. By leveraging technologies such as open source artificial intelligence and promoting collaboration among micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, we can close technology gaps and cultivate a more inclusive digital landscape. This session has brought together a distinguished group of government leaders, tech innovators, private sector trailblazers, institutional investors, and representatives from the diaspora community. Together, we will explore how the United States can tap into the African diaspora's unique strengths to influence strategic sectors from technology to the creative industries. We hope it will serve as a platform for forging partnerships and investing in diaspora-led projects that act as crucial economic connections between Africa and global communities. I look forward to meeting you all throughout the day. I encourage you to continue to follow our work here in New York and Washington in person and online. And with that, it's my privilege to welcome to the stage the Honorable Professor Kitila Mkumbo, Minister in the Office of the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, focused on planning and investment to deliver keynote remarks that will frame the vital dialogue to follow. So, President Mkumbo, over to you.
Mr. Frederick Kempe, the President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to not just to attend this very important forum, but also for being accorded the honor to speak and to deliver these key opening remarks. As I've been introduced, my name is Kitila Mkumbo. I'm the minister responsible for two things: coordinating planning and ensuring that my country remains attractive to investors. So I'm coordinating planning and investment. And I have my team here led by our very able ambassador, Elisi. And what I'm going to do here is to just highlight what we are doing as a country and how this technology can offer and contribute to our development agenda. So Tanzania, over the past 20 years, in terms of economy, has been growing quite steadily, on average of 6.1% over the past 20 years. The economic growth has been resilient even during difficult times, including during the time of pandemic, where our growth obviously slowed down, but remained around 4%, which was the strongest in the region. The issues that we are dealing with now is the fact that the economic growth that we want going forward is to ensure that it delivers inclusive prosperity, it delivers employment to our young people. As you're aware, like any other African country, our population is very young. 76% of population is below the age of 35. So going forward, we need to very much invest in education, but of course, in terms of future, really they're going to need employment. So our agenda is characterized by prosperity. We want to ensure that our economy produces prosperity, but this economy has to be inclusive. So the growth we're talking about has to be inclusive, addressing poverty, both in rural and urban areas. And the main study that we're using, it is key that we are able to develop our infrastructure. So integrated infrastructure remains a very important driver for our economic development. And this is because to be able to facilitate trade and investment, our people, and especially in the rural areas, our farmers should be able to move their goods to reach where the markets are. But also infrastructure remains a very important tool in terms of facilitating the intra-African trade and investment. Critically also, science and technology, which is the subject of today, is very important. In a way, digitalization has become a very important tool, especially in bridging the gap between the rural and the urban settings. So we have a strategy, a digital economic strategy, which is a 10-year strategy. And the focus here is to ensure that we are not just using digitalization as an economic tool, but actually it is a tool which is facilitating the urban-rural interaction and therefore halting the very rapid urban-rural migration. It is a tool which we aim at using to ensure that we are able to improve lives of our people in rural communities. And it is a tool which is advancing knowledge, science, technology, and innovation, which is a very important tool for the economic transformation in a manner that no one can be left behind. So going forward, we are going around the world, including here, our attendance in this particular meeting, and of course during the UNGA meeting, to ensure that we are holding action from our friends around the world to partner with us to improve our infrastructure development, and particularly the digital infrastructure. And not just digital infrastructure, but this time around, it is also about mass digital literacy. Because there is now a tendency of focusing very much in investing in the digital infrastructure. But just like in the 1970s and 80s and 1990s, where it was important to focus on mass literacy, it is also equally important now to ensure that our people have the necessary digital literacy. Because without digital literacy, it will be very difficult to talk of artificial intelligence. I think that we have to begin with the basics. Just like we started with education, we started with mass literacy, we went into secondary education before jumping into university education. I think with the digitalization also, we have to begin with the basics. Obviously, digital infrastructure investment is key. But alongside that one, we really have to invest on the digital literacy, which is a huge issue in Africa, and I think that this is always taken for granted. And with that one, our African diaspora friends are playing a very important role, given their knowledge, given their experience, given the exposure, given also their capital. We see them as important sources of all these things, including a source of the experience. Coming to investment and trade, digitalization is also proving to be very useful to facilitate trade and investment, especially in Africa. It is now possible to access markets all over in the world digitally. So digitalization is also solving the chronic problem of lack of infrastructure in Africa, because connecting Africa still remains a big challenge. While traditionally and for a very long time, it has been easier to travel from Africa to Europe and America than traveling within Africa. With digitalization, it is making possible. It is connecting Africa. Now Tanzania can communicate with the DRC very easily, with Kenya, with Angola, even though many of our people have not been there physically. So really going forward, digitalization is important. And just as we ensured universal access to education, we really have to be talking about ensuring universal access to digital facilities, which is why in my country, in our 10-year strategy, one of our strategies to ensure that all our people are connected, not just by physical infrastructure, but they're connected digitally to ensure that our people in urban and rural areas, regardless of their economic levels, they have access to digital infrastructure. They are connected with the internet beginning as the basic. And this is going to be a huge investment, not just financially, but also with respect to human resource. And this is why we are inviting our friends to help us in this journey, because we believe that with digital technologies improvement, we'll go a long way in addressing poverty, which remains a key aspect in our country. And we hope that in today's remarks, insights, we are going to learn some insights and some lessons on how can we accelerate digital access to our people, both in rural areas and urban areas. I thank you very much.
No, it's okay. We'll go forward.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Minister of State Mkumbo. of the great state of Tanzania. We have been lucky to 2 years ago to host Madam President Samia, and it's an honor to continue to partner with Tanzania. I would also like to say thank you to Fred Kemp for his kind words for the Africa Center and for his great leadership. Since day one, that's right, he has placed Africa Center and Africa at the center of the Atlantic Council's work. And as we just returned from Accra, where he showed great respect to another great state, Ghana, we awarded yesterday evening. It's a huge pride to work with him and with the Atlantic Council. So with that said, allow me to kick off the fireside chat. We have here two important guests who represent two organizations we partner with today, Afreximbank and Meta, a US company and an African development bank. Mrs. Kanayo Awani, Executive Vice President of Afreximbank, welcome.
Thank you.
And we will also welcome Kojo Boakie, Meta Vice President of Public Policy for Africa, Middle East, and Turkey. Today, as part of the Africa Center Diaspora program, we wanted to stress the role of the global diaspora communities in advancing the digital economy in Africa and influencing strategic issues too, ranging from creative industries to artificial intelligence. From the US, where the largest African diaspora lives, we were excited to learn a few days ago that Benin just passed a legislation giving Beninese nationality to all people of African descent who demonstrate an interest in obtaining it. A few years ago, Ghana launched the Year of Return from Washington, D.C. The panel, moderated by Janine Scott, our senior fellow, this morning, will offer the opportunity to discuss how to encourage diaspora-led projects. For now, it's my pleasure to welcome our two guests, like I said, and starting with you, Madam Kanayo Awani from Afreximbank. I would like our audience to better know your organization, Afreximbank, that is one of the largest development institutions on the continent. So my first question is, what are the priorities of Afreximbank when it comes to digital transformation on the continent? But before you answer, our audience will be pleased to know more about the large activities of your organization on the continent. So we have a 60-second video to show to the public. Madam Vice President, transforming Africa's trade in the digital space, what does it mean exactly?
For us. No, thank you. And thank you. I thank Atlantic Council for having Afreximbank here as a partner. Let me start by also apologizing on behalf of Professor Rama. He had a conflict today. He was meant to be here, not me. Hopefully I'll...
You are welcome as well. It's okay.
Hopefully I'll be able to do as good a job as he always does.
For sure.
No, a few years ago in 2017, we launched a transformative strategy we called Impact 2021, Africa Transformed. That strategy was hinged on 3 pillars, or 4 pillars, but I was focused on 3, which are external. The 4th one is internal to us. It was to promote intra-African trade and support the implementation of the AFCFTA, even though the AFCFTA had not come into force at the time. The second one was industrialization and export development. For obvious reasons, the continent was far too steeped in commodities trade, and it was important that we industrialize. Of course, intra-African trade will give us a unique opportunity to industrialize and make goods at home. And the third one was trade finance leadership. Those 3 strategies, those 3 pillars enable us to also focus on, if we're going to focus on intra-African trade, was also focus on the digital solutions. Mm-hmm. One of them which is well celebrated, is the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. The Pan-African Settlement System is a platform that we developed to enable African countries trade with each other in their local currencies. It was to do 2 important things: to reduce the informality of Africa's trade, but also to reduce our reliance on foreign exchange. And that's been launched and is operating. It was piloted in the West African Monetary Zone countries, and we're now extending it to other African countries so that they can integrate it into it, other central banks. The second one also, in looking at the challenges of intra-African trade, mm-hmm. is the fact that there's lack of access to trade and market information. Mm-hmm. And that's drawing from a historical past. Africans didn't have information on what their African countries, on what their neighbors produce, or where their markets are, because of the trade routes, how they were historically wired. Mm-hmm. So we needed to do something about trade and market information, and there were a couple of solutions that we had. Mm-hmm. One of them is to introduce a trade and market information solution platform, that we also introduced. We called it a Trader.
So despite all the, the powerful ability of Afreximbank to fulfill that huge objective, mm-hmm. you need partners to do that, right?
Of course.
Governments, and also private sector, and also foreign partners. So just allow me to transition to your colleague, Kojo here, who represents Meta, major US company, and who we partner with on this important event. Kojo, Nick Clegg, your president for global affairs, just returned from a long trip in Africa. We know that Africa is this is the home of the biggest digital revolution in the world in the last 2 decades. So could we have a few insights of this of Meta strategy in Africa? How can you support Afreximbank's work and other African countries? But before you answer, I will do the same. We are going just to launch a very short video about Meta's role in Africa.
Great.
As women, society tells us to be quiet. Listen to the silence, because silence is not really silence. Silence is really loud.
I want to scream and shout, I want to create, and I want the world to see my art and my story.
Change starts with us in anything. So we're all just making the world a better place by changing just one small thing.
Join me on this journey of discovering Africa as a destination for creativity and innovation.
Kojo, so this trip in Africa, what impact on Meta strategy on the continent?
So there are a couple of questions you asked actually. One was how are we working with partners like Afreximbank, and I think there's perfect alignment in what the Honourable Vice President has said. And first of all, I should start by saying all protocols observed to the Honourable Ambassador, Honourable Ministers, captains of industry, and future captains of industry, as well as those representing non-governmental organisations, etc. So first I'll say there's tremendous alignment with Afreximbank in a number of areas. One, they are seeking to break old colonial ties in the trade routes, etc. Two, they are thinking to drive forward, as the government of Tanzania are doing, with a digital transformation. A quick caveat as well, I believe that video, despite being tremendously important, is only part of our work rather than our full strategy. And I think this captures what we do with women and what we're doing in respect of tourism and highlighting the kind of innovation and creativity on the continent. But our strategy is much, much wider than that. And I should also add that Nick's trip was this year in March, so he hasn't just returned, but it's part of a long list of trips. So I've been at the company 8 years. I think the first big project I did was seeing Mark, our founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, travel to Nigeria and Kenya at the time.
They are your main markets, targets, or?
No, the whole continent is our target. Our mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. So even when you describe Meta as an American company, it's a fact, we are an American company, we're established here, but we have offices all over the world and people serving this company and serving our community of nearly 4 billion people all over the world.
Remind us, Meta, it's what brands?
Meta, well, I might be here a long time because there's some brands you might be unfamiliar with. 1, Facebook, 2, Instagram, 3, WhatsApp. But increasingly, if you think about it, we're in the space of open source AI. So Llama, I think, is now a brand. We have Oculus, which is giving people tremendous experiences.
And what is the most popular brand in Africa among those?
I would argue that
I'd
argue that it's still Facebook. But my director of Sub-Saharan Africa is still there, and she can give me the latest figures. But I'd argue that Facebook is probably the most popular brand. But as many people here know, perhaps not some of the Americans, the 100 billion Americans who are now on WhatsApp, WhatsApp is tremendously important as well, driving through many of the goals that Afreximbank is trying to achieve with regard to trade, but also keeping families connected, etc. But back to our strategy, it's about ensuring that Africa's creativity moves forward, but we are thinking about the foundational steps we need to make. So 1, how do we ensure, as the Honourable Minister spoke about, that we get people online and enable Africa to play its role in the global economy? One of the big investments we've made in the last few years is the longest submarine cable in the world, for the first time connecting East to West Africa or West to East, depending on your orientation. It brings more capacity, I think it's 180 terabytes of capacity to the continent than all the current cables put together. And it's landing in 19 countries, formed with 7 other partners. And it's here, in our view, to break the legacy models, just as Afreximbank is trying to do, models that have held us back. So I'm old enough to remember when we were beholden to SAT-3. I'm also old enough to remember before the Easy cable came on the east coast of Africa, where we had no submarine cable to take whether our telephone calls or internet traffic away from the continent. So we've decided and have been very deliberate about connecting Africa to the world, but also ensuring Africa is more connected with terrestrial fiber, etc. as well. So much more than just getting people to use the apps.
Sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned connectivity.
Yeah.
Are you aware that many Africans complain about the price, the cost of connectivity in Africa?
Absolutely.
How do you explain that, and how can you help to fix that too?
So part of that explanation is the fact that we have been beholden to monopolistic and oligopolistic behavior for a long time. And that's why our investments in infrastructure, whether it be submarine cables or the terrestrial cables that we've developed in places like Nigeria, Uganda, where Facebook is still banned, South Africa, DRC, is done on an open access basis, where our pricing is completely transparent, unlike many of the models that were there before. and where anybody, if you have the willingness and the finance and the expertise to develop a connectivity solution, can connect to the cable that we're providing. And that's one of the reasons why we believe we've been able to contribute alongside many other partners, including the mobile companies and infrastructure players that are on the continent now, all seeking to achieve this goal, to bring the price of connectivity down and get more people connected.
Thank you very much. Madam Vice President, I have a question about the way Afreximbank has been able to use the digital tools to boost and support African creative industries. We know that Afreximbank had a leading role on that space. Creative industries, it's fashion, it's music, it's movies. I'm not an artist person, but I recognize the power, the economic power of this industry in Africa, Nollywood, but not only Nollywood. So how did it started, and why do you think it's an emerging market, and why for Afreximbank it's important in the digital space?
Well, thanks. But let me just close my thoughts on the digital.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, and that was basically to say that, and just to agree with the minister from Tanzania, that we at the bank believe that, you know, Africa is fragmented. There are 55 African countries, fragmented, and I talked about lack of trade and market information, about lack of trade with each other. We believe that it is digitalization that will help us break those barriers and eliminate the borders that have so long held us back. On the creative industry, Africa is the demographics and the abundance of talents that got us into that space. Remember, I talked about a strategy that was transformative, and that strategy, we had to be deliberate about it to say, if we're going to deal with the issues of prosperity on our continent, we can't ignore the creatives, simply because it's a sector that employs people from 15 to 30 years old, the most significant employer of young people. And the young people exist. 200 million Africans are young on our continent. But it's not just about the demographics, it's also about the talent that exists. So we designed a strategy that focuses on several verticals, including film, music, fashion, arts and crafts, sports, literature, and more recently, gastronomy. And this is the areas where we thought we have competitive advantage, you know, among the young people, you know, and we developed strategies and products and programs, including digital as well, you know, around the creative industry. So we focus on how did we get into it? We knew that there were gaps.
Remind us the numbers, 1 billion, right? That's what you dedicate to this sector?
Yes, we dedicated one for now. Yeah, $1 billion. We have a pipeline about $600 million right now, and it focuses on several areas as well. The issue with, you know, with the creative is not necessarily just about financing. We do financing, and of course we also have debt, venture capital, as well as, you know, pure equity. We have a fund we call Fund for Export Development in Africa that focuses on equity and ventures. So there's the financing bit, there's a financing gap that we look to close. But there's also the gap of capacity and skills in the creative sector. So we've partnered, you talked about partnership with several organizations to boost capacity in that sector. Even in jewelry making, we launched with Chimamanda and Adichie a book. We did literature for workshops for young people who want to write. We launched with Trisk Academia what I call the jewelry making master classes. We even have master classes on music and songwriting, master classes on intellectual property custody. And then there's also the issue of, you know, the gaps in what I discussed earlier, lack of access to trade and market information, lack of access to markets. So even in the fashion space, we're supporting fashion designers at the Porto fashion runways, in Paris fashion Tranoi. Recently we supported African designers, African and Caribbean designers in Tokyo, and as well as in New York fashion. You know, so we're supporting this, enable them gain access to markets, to brands abroad, designers, so that they can be able to commercialize their talents. And there's also the issue of weak institutions. Intellectual property infringements It's very colossal when you think about the creative industry.
Yeah.
So we're also working with policymakers, the AFCFT and African Union, to see. Let me give you an instance. If you want to register your trademarking or your brand, intellectual property in Africa, you may have to not just go to the well-known intellectual property organizations, but some of them are not members. You have to go to several countries to go and register it, and people don't bother about it. I once met Yvonne Chaka who said to me, when she was 19, she was focused on fame. That's her popular song. I don't know who the Mkumbo, right? She earned nothing from it.
You mentioned property rights. This is the topic of the next session.
Okay.
The Africa Center, we're going to launch a new report on that very important topic that is at the heart of the creative sector. Allow me to go back to you, Kojo. Meta claims to be to have an impact on with social benefits on the continent. I would like you to talk about open source AI as a driver in global tech ecosystems in Africa. Can you tell us more about these benefits for creators, innovators?
I think the benefits are wider than creators and innovators first and foremost, and it's great to hear Afreximbank is doing the work they're doing with those people. One of the big things that came out last year and we've been able to launch is monetization on those apps that you think are most popular, certainly Instagram and Facebook over the last few years. And we've heard from President Ruto as well as many other heads of state. So great to hear that Afreximbank is doing that as well. Our view on open source and the reasons why those benefits are much larger than just amongst creators is the way we believe we've been able to democratize access to what we believe will be the continent-changing, world-changing technology that everybody else is confident it will be as well. And enabling people to access that, and enabling people to drive the innovation that will happen in AI, to drive the kind of safety and responsibility we think is phenomenally important. And we've also seen, not only do we believe that, we've also seen that in action already, whether it's the government of Nigeria using AI for its particular purposes, whether it's innovation impact grants that we've had. We had Llama Innovation Impact Award in the summer, in which we had 175 global participants. This boiled down to 10 finalists, and you had 3 of them from Africa. We're very, very mindful that AI is drawing expertise. We talked about the brain drain, but drawing expertise back to the continent. We're mindful that governments are commending us for being very different to many of our competitors in creating an opportunity for not only governments but also their citizens to access AI. And we're very mindful, again, to repeat it, that we believe the impact of AI and giving open access, providing open access AI will be much, much broader than that particular sector.
Yeah, and do you feel that the African governments have developed a regulatory framework to welcome these changes, or what kind of advice would you give to them?
So I think the progress, even I was speaking at an event yesterday where I spoke about the progress we've made in the last year. And what I heard in New York last year when speaking at Secretary Blinken's event and many others was that there was a real belief that AI has the ability to have a fundamental impact on whether we achieve or not the Sustainable Development Goals. And when I spoke to ICT ministers about regulation, many were saying, and the language around the threat of AI, those people who had seen RoboCop or Minority Report and felt the computers were coming to take over, the very measured response I got from many governments, heads of state and ministers was that actually I want to wait and see. I want to explore the opportunity. I think the opportunity is bigger than the threat, and I'm gonna wait and see. Since then, what we've seen is the African Union, thankfully, as well as many other governments, take that approach, but also think about how we create the governance frameworks around that as well. So we've been really infused by what we've seen on the continent. We've been really infused by the willingness to speak to us about not only our approach to AI, but also to speak to other companies whose approach is very different with their closed models. And we think that measured approach, where we're thinking more about the opportunity of AI, certainly open access AI is much, much better than having an approach where we proactively seek to regulate. So we've been infused by the progress that's happened through the African Union and many other institutions, but also what we're hearing from individual governments as well as many of the companies and players on the continent who are using our particular form of AI.
Kojo, I think you have a lot to say about Meta's activities on the continent. We are going to continue this conversation with your colleague, Balkisa, who will join the next discussion with the diaspora inclusion. But for now, I am under pressure to close this discussion. And Madam Vice President, speaking of intellectual property, I have to leave the floor to Aubrey Hubi, our senior fellow, and Eric Guichard, who is the author of the new Africa Center report on intellectual property, who makes very exciting, interesting recommendations to support the creative and innovative sector. So thank you very much. Thank you, Kojo. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
And now, Aubrey and Eric.
Good morning, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, please retake your seats as we welcome our next panel to the stage.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for staying with us. And, you know, as many of my friends say, happy Unga Week. It is quite a circus getting around and all the events, but hopefully you find them meaningful, the connections made valuable and lasting. So it's really a pleasure to kind of carry on the conversation that Rama and Kojo just ended on, which is the future of the creative industries in African markets. So I'm Aubrey Ruby, and I'm a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And this topic is near and dear to my heart because I, 10 years ago, published a book on the creative industries in African markets, and to see where it is today against what it was, even the potential 10 years ago, I couldn't even conceived. And really, I'm here in conversation with an old friend of mine, Eric Guichard, who's the founder and CEO of Homestrings, who's recently authored a report for us at the Africa Center about how to take the growth of the African creative industries to the next level. And in part, that's by monetizing and adding value and capturing more value from all the growth in African music, fashion, film. We know that the industry is worth, $1.5 trillion if you look at the whole market of people of African descent, wherever they live. It could be in the diaspora, which we'll talk about next on the next panel. But in order to do that, one of the greatest challenges we must overcome is a lack of intellectual property rights. And so Eric has authored a new report, and in that report, he really gives us a look at where we are today and what needs to be done. So Eric, tell us a little bit about what the landscape of intellectual property rights looks like today within the continent, and the challenges that result from that structure or lack thereof.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hubert. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to do this report, and specifically to Janine Scott, Ben Mossberg, and Masiri Yansane, as well as the Ambassador Yad as well. I think writing this report or doing research for this report was mind-blowing. In most part because of the size, the sheer size of the intellectual property that's being created by African creators on the continent. But at the same time, despite that volume of creation, there is some limitations in the lack of protection around those creations. And as a result, the creators have difficulty in monetizing their creations, and therefore there's lost wealth. But even at the national level, there's a loss of opportunity to repatriate foreign exchange, which ultimately strengthens, strengthens the economy. And so, based on that reality, the question was, what are the major
yeah, and there's
issues
also a challenge of financing it, right? Because you can't finance the asset if you don't own it.
That's correct.
And this is such a long and very challenging topic when it comes to Black creators.
That's correct.
Globally, right? And if you look even the history of music in the United States, how many Black artists were denied the rights to the royalties for what they created. Yeah. And so this issue is a big one, but the question is, even in a changing technology with social media and even more creation capacity, what is being done today about it in the region?
No, absolutely. The fragmentation of intellectual property protections on the continent is significant. 54 countries, almost half of them have their own, no harmonization, and therefore the lack of those strong protections, as you said, reduces the opportunity for monetization. And the question is, what do you do about that? Now, prop has to be given to Afreximbank with their initiatives in and around protecting creatives' rights as well as enhancing access to finance, but it's not enough. And the question is, how do you address that? Well, it turns out that, in the US, those protections around intellectual property run deep. The US Patent and Trade Office goes back to the 1800s in terms of case law in protecting intellectual property. Many diasporans have created intellectual property and have protected it in big markets like the US, and we're able to use those case laws to protect and generate revenues, royalties for misuse or even proper use of the intellectual property rights. So here, in this write-up, I recommend that access be given to African creatives, particularly in the film, fashion, and music industries, to have access to the ability to protect their intellectual property rights in the US market. It is a global marketplace. The consumption of African creations, whether it's music, whether it's fashion, whether it's film, is a global consumption market. And piracy is also global. The people who are pirating African creations are not necessarily in Timbuktu or Johannesburg. They're sitting in Brussels and New York and Idaho, for that matter. And so providing access to those kind of protections give African creatives, no matter who they are, the ability to have recourse and therefore have access to wealth creation, which I think is the ultimate objective.
So giving access for the US Patent Trade Office, what would that look like? And how would you respond to those who believe that African creators and governments need homegrown solutions and local kind of tech-enabled solutions? So can those things run in parallel? What would it look like?
No, so I addressed that issue in the report. These propositions are not mutually exclusive. The issue is protecting creations now so that they can monetize them now, while the 54 states and the regional bodies and the Afreximbank work on, and the AFCTA for that matter, work on harmonizing intellectual property protections and enforcement on the continent. They're not mutually exclusive, right? In fact, I go so far as to recommend that creatives register not only domestically and regionally through these organizations, but also register within the US in order to monetize today their creations.
And then what do you see as local homegrown? Can you give some examples of what's happening, maybe from a tech perspective?
No, absolutely. I was pleasantly surprised to find at least 3 case studies of African homegrown solutions using technology. One of them, particularly in the music industry, is Mdundo.com, which in fact came to the problem of protecting intellectual property rights through trying to reduce piracy of African music. And so through technology, they were able to create an environment where small musicians can register, have their music downloaded, be paid initially through advertising dollars, and then subsequently through big relationships with large music companies based out of the US. Similarly, Udux, udux.com, also has about 5 million members who are streaming African music, and they also provide visual, access to worldwide concerts. And then you have new creations such as poprev.dev, which uses a new technology called tokenization, where the tokens issued by musicians can help them raise money, small amounts of money, almost like crowdfunding, so that they can fund their growth. And this is particularly important for small musicians who are not well known, don't have the large streaming volumes on large platforms like Spotify.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a big movement towards that, the NFT kind of approach. And for example, I think of Osinachi, the Nigerian artist who was the first to issue an NFT at Christie's. I don't know if that's waning now. It seems like it's much less pushed and people have reverted back to a little bit more traditional models. But perhaps in the African context where, I think of Nigeria as one of the world's largest users of crypto and tokenization, it's even more readily adaptable.
Sure. No, I think there are 2 things. One, there's a technology. So the technology will remain and will grow, and its applicability will also grow. The hoopla around NFTs and underlying technologies, that's waning away as the technology moves into the mainstream.
And so, Eric, as we think about where we are today, which is a group of different regulatory bodies in African markets, and then you have non-regulatory players, which are these innovators, and then of course US PTO, which they have a bigger agenda that's not just Africa. How do we move forward? What are some key recommendations? Maybe you can go through 3 recommendations you have to maybe US government types, to African DFIs, or to African governments, and to creators themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in the short term, a relationship with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office is critical, and I think Afreximbank should link up with the USPTO to create a window that will fit their training program, their skills enhancement program for creatives in terms of securing their intellectual property rights. And there, again, policymakers, part of the U.S. foreign policy strategy could include providing that. Now, I think it's important to note that Chinese companies, Russian companies who are also creatives list their companies on the U.S. market, secure their creatives on the U.S. market. There's no reason why Africans couldn't do the same thing. So, and the U.S. market, just to provide some numbers, USPTO total size of the value of patents and licenses is about $6 trillion, which is about 25% of the U.S. GDP. It's quite significant. And in terms of financing, the U.S. represents about $50 trillion in terms of capital markets size, which is the largest in the world. So it is a missed opportunity not to connect. The second recommendation, I think, should be that the Afreximbank, again, and other funders should look at these innovators, Mdundo, UDEX, PopRev, and others, and provide capital to those companies so they can grow and basically cover more of the footprint in Africa. And they're not the only ones, obviously. And then last but not least, I think harmonizing between the various agencies that secure intellectual property rights on the continent through the Africa Free Trade Agreement, that should happen. It's a longer term proposition because you have to take into account mandates, et cetera. But I think that should be part of the sort of long-term recommendations.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is very valuable about this report is that often it's felt like the intellectual property issue has been brought forth by American companies saying, we need our IP protected in these markets. For example, a Starbucks, you know, someone making a logo that looks like Starbucks, putting coffee shops on a street, say in Addis, you know, this kind of thing. And so it seemed like it's almost like a Western, you know, regime being imposed. But here you actually have homegrown assets that are not fully protected.
Correct.
In the same way that you have the discussion about rooibos tea and other African medicinal remedies that aren't fully protected. And so I'm excited to see much more discussion of like homegrown need versus the idea that it's just being imposed from the outside.
No, absolutely. I think the more and more creatives understand the power of their creation, the monetary value of their creation, the collateral nature of their creation in terms of securing loans and other sources of financing, you know, the more we'll see the realization of that larger value. My interest, particularly in music, film, and fashion, was because those three, from a GDP standpoint, are quite significant in terms of the image of Africa that's being projected out into the world. And if you can monetize that and create converging incentives that people can actually make money by projecting, you know, Africa music, African fashion, and you know, and the rest of it, I think, you know, you'll see a transformed continent, basically.
And it's a form of, you know, we've talked many times about the need for infrastructure around the creative industries. Right. Like, you know, think about a Burna Boy trying to perform in Nigeria. There's not even stadiums big enough, right? It's hard for them to monetize theirs just from concerts and things because of lack of infrastructure. But this is another form of infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Right? The legal infrastructure that allows for deep monetization. And so, you know, if you had to leave our audience with our last minute here with a tone of optimism, do you see this as moving forward, or what makes you excited about the sector?
So two things make me excited. One, as I mentioned before, the fact that you have homegrown solutions that are being, despite all the challenges, that are being implemented and being grown. They clearly need additional capital, and I think they can find additional capital through some of the recommendations that we've made. And number two, there is no lack of creativity when it comes to African youth. I think what is most exciting to me in writing this report is that we've been talking about you know, youth unemployment for as long as I've been a professional. And I think writing about this, discovering the opportunity that this presents in terms of solving, at least in part, youth unemployment, giving the youth through technology the ability to secure wealth on their own terms is transformative. I think, and my hope is that in the next 3 to 5 years, that policymakers will listen to the importance of the creatives as a development pillar, not as an afterthought from a policy standpoint, but as a huge, significant, transformative pillar right there with manufacturing and agriculture and energy. I think that to me is the shining you know, the shining star in the horizon.
Well, thank you, Eric, for this overview of the report. For the audience here, you can download it. Maybe they'll flash up the QR code here, and it's available on the website if you want to dig in. So thank you for joining us today, and it's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's why we changed the stage for our next panel. So it's my pleasure now to welcome my colleague and friend from the Africa Center, Janine Scott, to have a conversation with a group of innovators that really bridge both the creative industries on the continent, but the power of the diaspora overall. And the diaspora has been one of the most defining elements of the US-Africa relationship. And it's a major market. So as we said, when we think about the market for African creatives, we think not only those that live today in Africa, but as a whole. So it's with that, it's my honor to welcome Janine Scott to the stage.
Thank you, Aubrey, and let me call my 4 panelists up as well. I have Balkisa, Abdullahi, Audu, and Almaz. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here. And as you know, the theme this morning is the global force of the African diaspora in shaping innovations. We've been talking about the creative and digital economy as a burgeoning frontier in global industrialization, and how the market really is expected to grow from about 250 billion to upwards of 480 by 2027. Technology is undeniably an influencer in facilitating this rapid rise and transition. And as Aubrey has just said, the diaspora is a very integral part of this moment, or in this movement. We have a very tight time and a very distinguished panel. I have 4 dynamic, distinguished diaspora disruptors. And so we're just going to get a glimpse into their work and their thoughts today. And I'm sure you can engage them after if you have other questions that you might want to raise with them. We have Ahmad Nagash, the CEO of the Africa Diaspora Network and member of the President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement. Balkisa Idosida, from the Public Policy Director for Sub-Saharan Africa at Meta. Abdoulaye Diallo, who's the founder and CEO of Border Nation. And Audu Makori, who's the co-founder and executive chairman of the Chocolate City Group. I'm going to start my questions with Audu, please. Audu, how has the rise of digital platforms reshaped the global reach of African music and film, in your opinion? And how can the African diaspora further amplify this impact? What are the strategies that you're using or that you see forthcoming in this domain?
Thank you. Can you hear me all? I think it's a very interesting story. When we started our company in 2005, there was so much piracy that it was easier to buy a blank disc than to buy a whole album on the streets of Lagos. I repeat, it was easier and cheaper to buy a blank a CD with a whole record with 12 songs than to buy a blank CD plate. And today we're talking about easily 15 billion streams a year. And this is across all platforms. This is Spotify specifically speaking. And I think that what has really given that rise is the diaspora, obviously, because in 2019 I was walking down probably Times Square, I think, and I heard it was Wizkid's song being played. And I was trying to look at where the song was coming from. It was coming from a police car in New York. So I walk up to him, I'm like, how do you know this guy? He's like, of course we know Wizkid, of course we know. African music has always been amazing, but right now we have direct access. Why? The platforms. There's YouTube, there's Spotify, there are all these channels. And every African is repping his community one way or the other. And then, of course, they're now integrated with people. So it's become a global sound. I was looking at some statistics the other day that Afrobeat music is now the fastest growing genre in the world. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about maybe 23 to 30% of the streaming numbers on Spotify. So that's a great thing. But there are challenges, obviously, and the last speaker talked about intellectual property enforcement and making sure that there's registrations across borders and et cetera. But I see, for me, the key issue is about not just amplifying the voices, but being able to create a space where people can monetize this content. Mm-hmm. You'd be surprised to find out that the streaming numbers in Africa, and this is film and music, for example, is 80% of that is diaspora. It's not from the continent itself. And one of the challenges, internet access, internet affordability. It's quite expensive to stream this content. And what happens then is that African creators are shortchanged because the numbers that you get as an African stream is worth much less than a European or American stream. Now, why is that? Because maybe the subscriptions for Spotify might be $11 a month. Back home it's about $3 or $4. So obviously, we're being shortchanged. Mm-hmm. I think that the solution really is around creating more digital platforms that are locally based. Eric talked about Ndondo. And Dondo, I think, is a Danish company or from Denmark or something, but it's based out of Africa. I think that there's a need to invest a lot more in the digital infrastructure so that people can be, so the pricing is correct and people can actually target a wider audience. Think about 1.2 billion people on the continent, and Spotify at most is about 200 million people around the world. So I think that's one. The second thing is I think there's a need for more financing for women, especially women-run entrepreneurs. So not on the creative side. And what we've done at Chocolate City, next year we're going to be 20 years as a company, and we're doing that. We're marking that by setting up a fund. We're raising an initial $1 million, and we're putting 50% of that into female businesses. And the reason why is this: when you look at the film and the fashion sectors, and even the film and the music sector, women drive a lot of that. The biggest film personalities on the continent today are females in the African continent. Now with music, it's not quite the same. Obviously, it's a more expensive endeavor because there's so much more, in terms of promoting female entrepreneurs. Artists. So our focus is creating a fund for the business people, for the managers, for the lawyers, because there needs to be more professionalism in that. And then I think the third issue is really around education. We talked about piracy. We talked about copyright enforcement. The biggest challenges that we have today is that people do not even understand what their rights are. The first contract I did, I'm an attorney, the first entertainment contract I ever resolved, the guy signed away his recording rights in perpetuity. He didn't even know that there'll be a time where he needed to end the contract. So more education, more copyright enforcement, more strategic financing. I mean, people talk about financing. Afreximbank is doing a great job, but I think much more private individuals should be able to put in small sums and fund these enterprises to empower the people. So primarily, if we're able to fund the creative economy of Africa and get the right people there, we're going to be creating jobs. There'll be significantly reduced poverty, and then there's something called film, music, and fashion-induced tourism. So that brings more money to countries. So that's my view.
Thank you so much, and that leads me very well into Bankisa. Meta has recently introduced new monetization features for content creators across the continent, and it's meant to transform the way that young people earn in the digital economy. Can you tell us a bit more about this? What steps are being taken to expand this digital monetization across the continent? Fits very well into some of the things that Audu has just raised as issues.
Thank you, Janine. So I want to start by saying that the partnership that Meta has with Africa and African creators is not new. It's been years that we have been collaborating with the entire ecosystem. We have been with them, listened to them to understand what are the roadblocks that they are facing, but also what are the opportunities that are available and that can allow them to really unlock the opportunities available for all content creators in Africa, but African content creators outside as well. And that's the reason why our strategy in Africa is really multi-pronged. So number one, we have infrastructure, and my VP who was here earlier did mention our investments and hundreds and thousands of subsea cable that we actually laid and that's connected over 20 countries, the latest being to Africa, which is expected actually to generate around 36.9 billion USD in its first 2 to 3 years of operation. The second pillar is really capacity building. And Audu, you mentioned that education capacity building is really important for us to equip creators with the skills that they need to thrive in a digital era. And what I would say about our capacity building programs is that I really like them because it's not one fits, and it really looks at the needs of content creator no matter where they are. For some of them, it will be skills in terms of leadership. For some, it will be skills in terms of how to grow a business, accounting, fundraising. For others, it's about building a brand and positioning themselves and their products online. For others, it's about how to stay safe online. And several women entrepreneurs and creators have actually told us that. So far, as a company, we have invested over 1 billion USD globally to support creators, and that's only in capacity building. In sub-Saharan Africa, we trained more than 350,000 entrepreneurs, creators, and we reached millions of SMBs. And all of that, it's really with the aim of responding to their needs in terms of capacity building and education. The third pillar for us, it's partnership. And earlier on the panel and the conversation on intellectual property, policy making came up, and that's actually one that we prioritize. So we work a lot with regulators and governments just to contribute, share our experience, share also best practices when it comes to policing and regulation that enables and supports the creative industry. In addition to that, we also collaborate with government, when it comes to specific campaign that they are running. I can give an example, like Côte d'Ivoire, they had a campaign about called Sublime Côte d'Ivoire. It's about rebranding the country and positioning it as a tourist destination. So through our collaboration with them, we managed to actually get them to prioritize collaboration with content creators to change the narrative about their country, the continent, as a destination that is accessible to all, that has a lot to offer. And this is very important to us, the collaboration with content creators, because it really allows to avoid the danger of a single story, as mentioned by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And so it's very important to do that. The last pillar, I would say, is really about making sure that the voice of content creators is heard internally, that's at Meta, and making sure that the products, the tools, the features that we develop are really respond to the need. And that's actually what led us to expand some of our monetization tools, including Facebook in-stream and Real Ads in July, June of this year, to enable creators to earn a living from what they love doing, from their passion. And today, there is no denying and say that African creators are actually changing the trends in so many different industries. And I think it's Rolling Stone who mentioned that Wizkid and teams are actually reshaping sounds and texture of pop music. Oh, wow. And I would mention, that on Spotify, Afrobeat has been really picking up. And in last year, actually, it's been streamed, I think, 14 billion times, Afrobeat. That's amazing. And it just shows how African creators, how the creative industry in Africa is becoming not just a nice to have and add on, but it's actually a tool for soft power. And the continent has an opportunity unique to really size that, impose themselves, and impact the world. Because we know it. In 2050, 1 out of 4 people on this earth will be African. By 2030, Africa will have the largest workforce. And according to studies, by 2050, the creative industry will generate $712 billion USD. So that's really an opportunity for all of us to size, whether you are a private company, whether you are an NGO, civil society, or government. All of us should have, our eyes on Africa. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And you spoke a lot about partnerships and the collaboration and so forth. Almaz is probably a good example of how partnerships work and the kinds of things that she does, especially with young people, entrepreneurs, and the like. So Almaz, how are members of the African diaspora strengthening global networks, fostering strategic partnerships, and supporting the digital economy? How do you feel that the diaspora can contribute to the knowledge and skills transfer to bridge this digital divide? It's kind of a follow-on to some of the issues that Balkisa has just raised.
Thank you. Thank you for the Atlantic Council for having me. I'm really happy to be with all of you. I am reminiscing simply because when I started African Diaspora Network 14 years ago, the conversation on diaspora, Melvin knows, was just a few here and there, and even the assumption that we can bring 54 diverse countries together at a table, and on top of it, in partnership and collaboration, like a naive idea, but I believed it to my core. And I'm very happy to say to you today that it does work. It wasn't an assumption, it's a reality that the diaspora has so much to offer into the conversation, specifically on how we might. It's not necessarily that we own the space of knowledge and expertise, because talent in Africa is also there. I think our job is not, I would say that my job personally is not to tell what African youth needs to do to improve their lives, rather to provide them the tools and the resources that they need, and to become their co-partner in thinking, in providing access to resources, and specifically mentoring, which is the digital knowledge, any knowledge. Even here where we are, I don't think I can say that I own my life on my own. No, I'm not an island. I have had so many people to support me to be where I am today. And it's exactly the same thing what the diaspora, what we're trying to do at ADN is, when we started this idea, we thought, okay, can we bring people together? That's the first thing you do. And then you bring them to have a conversation. And the next thing is the action. You cannot just keep talking. You have to show some action. And so we created the Builders of Africa's Future. So I need to tell you this in a way on how ADN does it. It's not enough. We still need more of that. But I think what we've done was that community that we brought together, we start driving them, not saying, okay, can you mentor this person? Can you mentor that person? Can you open the door to other people? So I think this network, in a way, it ended up being a vessel that is holding many different aspects of the work that we're trying to do, where it becomes to supporting the grassroots entrepreneurs under the Builders of Africa's Future, or our newest, which is now about 3 years old, Accelerating Black Leadership and Entrepreneurship. So the diaspora is not necessarily only, I am an Eritrean American, but I am also more than that. And so in a way, how do we then support the African Americans and the African diaspora in the United States? That program is actually supported by a fintech company in Silicon Valley, Bill.com, or now they're called Bill. And so I'm very proud of also the Silicon Valley community supporting an entrepreneurship program. Where is that knowledge and resource coming from? Where is the support coming? From the diaspora. And so the diaspora end up being mentoring, opening doors. Why is opening doors important for us? Opportunities are everywhere, but access to opportunities are not everywhere. And providing access to opportunities to African diasporans and those grassroots entrepreneurs on the continent is critical for the work we do. I also wanted to just say that it is not only the talent and the skills transfer that ADN is working on. We are actually really moving on something that was considered bold, but it is not necessarily bold, but it's necessary in itself, going beyond remittances. Why am I saying that? Because the African diaspora provides or gives in remittances more than $80 billion per year to the continent, 3 times more than what Africa gets from from development. And then in that case, Nigeria is the best case on remittances. In 2022, the Nigerian diaspora remitted $20 billion to Nigeria, and then less than 0.9 billion in foreign direct investment. And so I am not only challenging, I'm actually really asking this question. If the money is coming from the diaspora, who has a vested interest in making sure that the community and the people are supported, why wouldn't African government and other leaders start to bring the diaspora as a co-investor and co-partner intentionally? To think that you're just sending the money to your family. I'm not saying don't send your money to your family, but that's not scalable. That's not enough. We could do more. And the reason I say we can do more is we also have savings. We, the diaspora, are good at saving. That we need to tap into our saving and start to really think beyond just doing this transactional relationship which we have with our families. It could be sometimes very dicey as well, because that money is not going to go further. And I think it is not only just sending our, sharing our skills and providing access to resources, it's also us ourselves really becoming a co-investor. But in order to do that, we need our governments to create an enabling ecosystem to invest and also to really take the diaspora very seriously and to begin to really look at how can we have this private-public partnership with the diaspora. So I really think we have a great opportunity. I know we don't have a lot of time, but you can see how much passionate I am about this. But yeah, we have a long way to go. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Almaz. Yes, I know you have a lot to say, and you can engage with people afterwards, perhaps. Abdullah, following on some of the things that she's raised about the diaspora, the engagement, and so forth, you use your media platform to really change the narrative about Africa in the first instance, but not just to tell more positive stories, but also to influence investment opportunities and the like. So what ways do you think the African diaspora can leverage tools, platforms to address socioeconomic challenges and bridge these gaps in healthcare and education and other areas that you also try to focus in when you're doing your work?
Thank you for having me. I think that the African diaspora is the most equipped people to influence and change Africa. And I can say that because I'm an example of that. Over the past 3 years, we have, through our company, we have managed to bring business to Africa that resulted into millions of dollars into the economies. And we are also on the ground. You see, everybody have a plan for Africa except Africa, right? and you know, we talk a lot about investing, about being part of. When I'm on the ground, from January to March, earlier this year, we spent about $150,000 within small pipelines across the continent, right? I went to 15 countries within those 3 months just to talk to entrepreneurs. I'm specifically focused on media and storytellers, right? Because I think they are the best ambassadors Africa have, right? You can have the best product in the world. If your clients don't know about it, nobody will buy it, right? And so the diaspora is really equipped. However, we can't sit here and make these plans without going on the ground and actually training, implementing, investing in these young people that are coming up, right? And every company that don't have an Africa plan, you have no plan for the future. Because clearly with the future, you mentioned about the size of the economy, there's 600 million people in Africa that have cell phones, right? Africa is the only place in the world that don't have a global megaphone. The only place in the world, right? The Middle East have Al Jazeera, the US have CNN, have all these other guys, Europe have all BBC and all. We have nothing, absolutely nothing. And I have a harder time convincing African leaders who I work with closely across different countries, or African entrepreneurs, or African corporations, to see value in their own local media than international media companies, right? And I work with international media companies. You know, I bring them to the continent. But they would rather listen to them, and those guys will come to me to help them do the same thing I was just telling these guys. So I'm saying all this thing to say, we need to build the capacity on the ground. We need to create opportunities so African creative can monetize. Meta, YouTube plays a vital part into that, right? Creating these opportunities. We shouldn't come to the US or to go to Europe in order to monetize our content, you know? And so for us, we are really focused on one thing only. How do we bring investment onto the continent? And how can we train the next generation? We use our own resources to train young Africans to tell their own stories, because that's how I was trained, right? So this is really important. Collaboration beyond just talking, right? Can you be on the ground? Can you put your money where your mouth is, instead of just saying Africa need this, Africa need this? We all know what Africa needs, but are we investing in what Africa needs? And that's what I'm focused on.
Thank you so much. We are sadly out of time for this panel, but I'd like you to thank our panelists for their insights. They certainly have a lot more to offer, as you can tell. And speaking of next generation and how we can be more creative in terms of moving forward, I'd like to call Mr. Melvin Foote, who is the president of the Constituency for Africa, to help close out our panel.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Ambassador Ramayad, who's my good friend, and the Atlantic Council for organizing, bringing us together. Atlantic Council is breaking new ground in terms of building support for the diaspora here in this country, but around the world. So I applaud them for that. I want to also say that, the creative industries, and Eric spelled it out in his report, and we're talking about music, we're talking about sports, we talk about fashion, we talk about food. This is going to drive the world going forward. And Africa's time is now. And everywhere you go, you see influences from Africa. I've been told to try to close this thing down in 3 minutes. And I already got a 20-minute speech here, but I got to cut it real short. But I want to say that the unity of Africa is going to be the key, And we already talked about all the countries in Africa. We got to break the boundaries and get Africa working together. And we also got to engage the diaspora fully. And the diaspora is starting to emerge. When I first went to Africa in 1973, I've been working on Africa for 50 years. 50 years. And people told me, my father told me, I'm going to get eaten by a lion. And I thought Tarzan would be at the airport when I landed. But you see where Africa is today, at the headlines of the world. We are preparing for a change in leadership in this country. You guys may have heard about the presidential election going on now. We have got to actually impact that policy right now. We got to make sure whoever becomes the next president of the United States has Africa as its background, as Africa is a key element of this. We in the diaspora in the United States have got to drive that policy. And so I want to put that plug in right now. I'm telling Kamala Harris that we got to educate Americans about Africa. Even to this day, outside of New York and Washington, you say how many countries in Africa people don't even know. So here we got this great continent with all these resources. We got a population that's going to take over the world. It's Africa. And so we have a role to help to get America to actually influence Africa in a way that's going to, lead us and make sure that African people. But we also got to make sure that Africans, African Americans, and other Africans in the diaspora are synergistic and working together in this regard. So I just really want to just say thank you to the Atlantic Council for bringing us together here. I think the program is just outstanding. There's so many takeaways. We need to take this over to the UN General Assembly, really. That's where this needs to be. Make sure they get a copy of the tape, because everything that needs to happen has been said today. So I want to applaud the Atlantic Council. Can you stand up and give them come on, stand up. Thank the Atlantic Council for bringing us together and making this happen. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.